Okay, Brother David, would you please like to introduce yourself so people can know what you're all about?
Certainly. So
Yes.
my name is David Livingstone,
Yes.
and I was born and raised in Montreal. I was raised in an agnostic family, and after a lot of searching, I came to Islam in 1991. It was also at the same time that, well, actually, I just come out of university, and my my path university was part of my path of self-development and research. So those two went hand in hand, and I guess what really astounded me is that even though after I had found Islam, which is effectively the truth, my search was still to continue substantially. So there was still a lot to discover, a lot to understand the world we live in, but it's also understanding the world through the light of Islam, right? So it's not just a matter of knowing that God is one and what we're commanded to do. The hadith says that explore knowledge even if it takes you into China. I also like the one that says something along the lines of, our knowledge is a prick in just a dip of a pin in the ocean.
Yeah, and it's compared to the knowledge of Allah.
Yeah. So, even if all the research I've been doing, so I've been at it steady now for 35 years. I've written 6 books, and I'm still astounded that I can still find deep aspects to the things that I've been studying. I thought thoroughly. It just shows you how much there is to explore. And so that's what it is. It's basically been a path to try to understand. Like I said, it doesn't end with Shahada. Shahada was really just the beginning. And I expect it's going to continue. There's always going to be more to learn. But of course, we live in a time where the Islamic world is in collapse. So we live in a state of siege, it's kind of occupation. It's a global occupation where the Western powers have ascendancy, but Western powers also basically have established puppet societies throughout the world.
Exactly.
So most of the so-called Islamic societies are really societies where a regime has been put in place to placate the Islamic world, to effectively give them just enough semblance of Islam so that they'll keep quiet, but of course nothing near the true message. So, and with their takeover, they've been able to, like they say, the history is written by the winners. So living in a time when history has been rewritten, this has been a very thorough project. So that you'll find that the propaganda version of history is dominating specifically in the West, but also has filtered or rippled across the world. And being that Muslims are in the state of weakness that they are, there is a profound depth of ignorance. And so that's why my research is not just curiosity, but it's in effect an attempt to get back to a status quo, to a minimum state of understanding that would be necessary to operate in the world we're living in.
So, like you said, you became Muslim in 1991, right?
Yeah.
So after becoming Muslim, what was the first turning point when you started thinking like the way you think now?
Yeah, well, it kind of happened before. So because I had already got to a point where I fundamentally questioned the world. I guess you could say I got introduced to a conspiratorial interpretation of history. So everything was up in the air. I was ready to not only reinterpret everything that I had learned, but intent on trying to get after the truth, intent of getting past, because it was a pretty hard thing to deal with when I had realized that, because I had worked really hard to try to stay on the truth, to try to not get duped by the lies that were propagated, and so it was pretty depressing when I found out that the ideologies and thoughts that I had adopted, thinking that they were taking me outside of the indoctrination, was just another form of indoctrination.
So it was like a lie over a lie, basically.
Yeah, it's all like all the layers of the onion.
It's like
And
sometimes, okay, yeah, please.
yeah, so it's like what I recognize is that I had tried to get outside of the layers of the onion, and the struggle I had is how far do you go? And it's only when I found Islam that I realized you have to go outside of the onion.
Exactly.
It's the only
It's
liberation.
an entirely different vegetable on its own.
Something like that. The entire vegetable is a con.
True.
So basically, as I got to that point, and as I was looking to try to understand the world, understand what was really happening, that's how I found Islam. But then Islam gave me because that's the thing. This is what I think a lot of Muslims don't understand, is that the Islam, people, it goes to the heart of the problem with the Islamic world today. That Muslims tend to, because they've been secularized, so they kind of treat Islam as a religion, much like it's treated in the West, where Islam is a personal belief system that applies to personal life. This is why Muslims seem to think that they can operate in a Western society, because it's a personal observation. But really, Islam is a criteria. Islam is a perspective. It's a context that allows you to interpret and operate in the world that you're living in. So it helps you decipher the world that you're living in. So that's, coming to Islam, that's what it gave me. It gave me the tools to now be able to deconstruct the world that was operating around me. And that's effectively what I started to do, is that I recognize a lot of things that I had been taught at university, which were suspicious, and Islam gave me the tools to deconstruct those and arrive at help support me in my effort to arrive at something which is hopefully closer to the truth.
So do you, like, as we can see that we are in times that everything is too much like covered up. So did you suspect any sort of conspiracy, just like in any organization or any sort of a thing, establishment? Did Islam had that?
That there was a conspiracy in Islam or through
Yeah,
Islam, you mean?
yeah, no, not through Islam, because Islam, look, in my view, Islam is
Yeah.
according to the book that was revealed to
Yeah.
the Prophet, right?
Right.
So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about as in people conspiring
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that took me a while. So I think what happens to a lot of converts is that you're so pleased and so enthusiastic to have discovered this truth, and you look forward to joining with your fellow believers, and that enthusiasm can tend to make you naive and maybe idealistic, and but then you get this immediate struggle where you can see a contrast between your expectations and the reality. And that for a long time was difficult to make sense of. I had to fight with myself. I questioned myself if I was being too judgmental, because what I was seeing in practice didn't mirror with what I understood of Islam. And like a lot of converts that I've met, they say, they came to Islam without meeting Muslims, which is sometimes a good thing.
Yeah,
I'm
because
sorry to say.
no,
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
I tell people a story. It's like a strange story that like a
Yeah.
person was a castaway and he was there for 30 years on an island, and there was no way he could get back. And over there he found some runes. In the drawer he found a dusty book called the Quran. He could read Arabic, and he
Right.
found it, and he's like, I'm glad, and he's happy. You know what I mean? But
Right.
once he gets to the people are gonna
Right.
corrupt him, and he's gonna be like, oh God, I want to go back to the island.
Something like that. Something
Exactly.
like that. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that it took me a while before I understood the mechanisms that were responsible for that disconnect. And because it's twofold, right? I mean, the people are responsible for themselves, but also there is a historical context that kind of produced this this kind of ignorance. And I'm sorry to say that when of course, I was looking to be to do everything I could to practice Islam well, to practice Islam properly. I was enthusiastic about learning as much as possible. And the one group that stood out in those that were around me at the time that seemed to be the most dedicated were the Salafis. So, and I had no idea. And that's the thing, is that most Muslims converts come to Islam today, and their idea of Islam is a very unstructured kind of perception of it, where, you see all these societies, like you have ISNA and ICNA, and then of course you have the Salafis, and almost every mosque has a different approach and ideology. Yeah. And we don't, because we're so new to it, we don't understand how this is a problem, and that this is not reflective of the historical reality of Islam, but rather a consequence of the consequence of the destruction,
the corruption,
and the corruption.
Yeah.
So a lot of groups are considered part of the Sunni fold, and I finally discovered there's many clues that came together, and I finally discovered that the Salafi movement was basically, in short, was a part of a Zionist plot to try to undermine Islam, and that really helped me in my second book, which is where it's called Terrorism and the Illuminati, which is really where I explored the long-term relationship. I first explored the history of the occult, and then I showed how it branched into the Islamic world and effectively produced the Salafi movement, as well as of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, and then modern day terrorism, which is why I called it Terrorism and the Illuminati. But then also my other book, which is Black Terror, White Soldiers, then I looked at it a lot more closely, and I went back to the more of the details of the history of the development of Islam to trace, because what makes the Salafi stand out, the core of their mission, was effectively to attack the closing of the doors of ijtihad. Right? So this was their agenda as well. They shared the exact same agenda with the Wahhabis, and of course the Wahhabis had started 150 years before the Salafi movement, 1700s, with Sheikh al-Wahhab, and he also himself revived the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah. And so this is where you see a confluence of British and Masonic influences in Islam, because this was the only way. And this is the point that Muslims have forgotten, because the reason why the doors of ijtihad were closed was because if the debate, it was narrowed down to 4 schools, but it could have been so many more, right? And that's the point, is that every time you introduce an opinion, you're potentially introducing a new school, which is why the doors had to be closed, so that you could limit the expansion of the debate and allow the debate to proceed to more substantial subjects. And the beauty of it is, and that's the point, right? This is why God says in the Quran to hold tight to the rope of Allah, and that's what this means. Because the madhabs are our rope back to the Prophet. And so if we want to, it's the protection, it's the armor of Islam. So the British knew that. Now that they had basically, were gaining control over Egypt in particular, so places like al-Azhar, they were gaining influence in Arabia. But what they needed to do was, if they were going to make Islam amenable to their imperialist agenda, they needed to, you can't modify Islam, so the only thing they could do was to remove Muslims from their scholarly tradition, because if they wanted, basically the British wanted to rewrite Islam. They wanted to propose laws and approaches and interpretations that were going to be favorable to their agenda. And that was impossible as long as the doors of ijtihad remained closed, as long as the Muslims remain firm to the four madhabs. So the only way to contest that was to argue, and this is what Jamal al-Afghani did, was to argue that the Muslims state of deterioration was because they had fallen away from Islam, which is true. But his lie was to propose that the reason was because of the closing of ijtihad, and the only way for Muslims to improve their situation was to reinterpret, to reopen the doors of ijtihad to allow them to so-called adapt Islam to modern times. So this is how they opened the can of worms, and this is basically the main strategy that they took. And then, of course, in alignment with Saudi money, which was Rockefeller oil money, they were able to spread this ideology worldwide. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but it's from what I experienced, especially in Canada and North America, that the Salafi Wahhabi approach is effectively completely. You go to every mosque and everybody prays like a Wahhabi. It's become
taken over.
New madhab. Yeah. And so by removing the true definition of what it means to be a Sunni Muslim, which has always been until 100 years ago, that it means to follow one of the four schools, they've basically argued that to be a Sunni is to follow Abu Bakr. So now anybody who can claim, who accepts the succession of Abu Bakr is now a Sunni, which is how you can get this plethora of sects and movements who are effectively not Sunni, who falsely claim that they are. And that's why you get this chaos now of everyone basically educating themselves and no scholars who are basing themselves on authentic traditions. And by authentic, I don't mean, Sahih Hadith. I mean the proper traditions of scholarship to fortify and support their instructions to their followers. So that's how you get this basically complete chaos and situation like I did. You coming to the Islamic world of all these groups. Back to the original point, right? All these groups that are all claiming to be following Islam, but really so far from it, which is reflected in their behavior, because their behavior is not founded on a much of a spiritual understanding. It becomes focused on outward practice and ritual, which they falsely believe is an indication of piety.
Okay, so when I did a little research on your stuff, what do you think about because you very explicitly talk about the Dönmeh, the Turkish Muslims,
right.
And then you make a connection with the royal family.
Yeah.
And I would like to know a little bit about Harran. You know that place?
Right. So
yeah, please.
Yeah. So those are two huge topics. So those are two independent ones, but they're interrelated. So basically, the city. What happens is that I'll go very quickly because it's it would be a lot of detail to explain the history of the occult. But basically, it can all be. It all seems to be referred to in Surah Al-Baqarah 101 to 102, which talks about the angels Harut and Marut, who teach magic to apostate Jews, who then falsely attributed this knowledge to Solomon. This becomes the basis of Freemasonry, because the Freemasons, effectively, their goal is to try to rebuild the third temple, because the temple was supposedly built by Solomon, who used the seal of Solomon, which is a ring with the six-pointed star, which gave him control over the jinn. So we know in Islam that God gave Solomon control over the jinn, which allowed him to build the temple. But in Masonic interpretation, this was magical power. So effectively, how they interpreted the craft of Freemasonry effectively is the idea that you can use. I'm not saying every Mason. I'm sure 99% of Masons don't think like this, but at the core, those who developed the cult of Freemasonry itself would have understood it like this, because it's derived from the Kabbalah. The idea that they would use magic to rebuild a new world order, effectively, to make a long story short, which they allegorically refer to as the third temple. So what happens is that After this cult is developed in Babylon, it spreads to the Greek world, where it becomes Greek philosophy, the Roman world, where it becomes Neoplatonism, Hermeticism in Egypt, and within Christianity is called Gnosticism. And it contributes to all these various mystery cults, the mysteries of Osiris, Isis, and Mithras, which is the most famous one, which had a heavy influence on Christianity. And what happens is that with the fall of the Roman Empire, the Platonic Academy, which had sort of maintained the ideological, philosophical aspect of this cult for centuries, some of them, according to reports, ended up in Harran, in southeastern Turkey. And Harran has a very interesting history because it's close to a part of Turkey called Kilikia, which is the original birthplace of Mithraism. It's the birthplace of Paul, the false apostle, the Kabbalistic apostle of Christianity.
Okay.
And so in Harran is the seat of a secret, not a secret society, an occult society community called the Sabians. And they are not they named themselves deliberately after the Sabians of the Quran in order to gain
the Sabbateans, you mean? From the Quran.
The Sabians.
Okay, the Sabians, yeah.
The Sabians, who basically are descended from the Queen of Sheba. So they falsely appropriated that title to gain themselves legitimacy as the people of the book, but they are not the true Sabians. And so this Sabian community becomes enormously influential because they had preserved all the occult traditions, which had basically almost disappeared everywhere else. And then it's through them that this occultism infiltrates into Islam. They become sought after as translators because this is a time when the Muslims had conquered enough parts of the world that they could now begin to focus on scholarly studies, and they discovered Greek philosophy, and a lot of those works were translated by the Sabians, and they had an important influence on two trajectories. One of them was Sufism, and the other one was the sect called the Brethren of Sincerity, Ikhwana Safa. They're translated in English as either Brethren of Sincerity or Brethren of Purity, who were an Ismaili sect. Okay. And so why this is important is because, according to Masonic legends, when the Templars, the Knights Templar, an order of crusading knights, were in the Holy Land, they came into contact with the assassins. And the various legends said that the Eastern mystics were rescued from the Holy Land and brought to Scotland, and that's the origin myth of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So effectively, what these Eastern mystics were in reality were some kind of Middle Eastern occult society that would have been influenced by the Sabians, because ultimately they trace them back to the Essenes. So if you look at most of the legends in Freemasonry, they always trace whoever these Eastern mystics are back to there's numerous legends like in Egyptian Freemasonry and various branches of Freemasonry that trace them back to some kind of a Gnostic who had been converted to Hermeticism back in the time of Christ and had preserved these teachings, who were then inherited by the Templars.
So it's like all of them can branch back to the same kind of roots. One person taught some education, got spread out, yeah.
Because it's the Kabbalah. They look at the Kabbalah as being, the core wisdom that was brought down by the fallen angels.
Do you think in this modern time Kabbalah is being practiced in religious offerings and stuff? In an obscure manner.
You look at what's happening in Israel right now. That's Kabbalah being enacted, right? The Kabbalah basically teaches that the Jews as a race, not as a religion,
as a better race kind of thing,
are entitled to. That they are entitled to God's promise. That God's promise is everlasting, regardless of their actions. It also teaches. I've mentioned this a few times, but there's a great book on called Jewish Fundamentalism by two Israeli historians. I can't remember. I only remember the last name of one of them, Shahak. And he shows that that a lot of non-Israeli, non-Jewish writers are ignorant about the true teachings of Kabbalah because most of the material has not been translated, and the only way to find these incriminating facts is to read Israeli historians of Kabbalah. And that's where you find that it's in the Kabbalah that teaches that non-Jews are effectively devils. And so that's why when you find a lot of the racist policies, most of the groups, especially like you look at revisionist Zionism, religious Zionism in particular, they're all, because Zionism is historically antithetical to Orthodox Judaism, right? Zionism had no basis. They weren't able to appeal to Orthodox Jews, so they had to base their claims on accusations of anti-Semitism, or they had to claim that they were a response to anti-Semitism. And it's only later that once the Zionist movement took hold, that now you get this new movement called religious Zionism, which attempted basically to marry Zionism, which was originally a secular nationalistic political movement, and try to mix it with some religious justifications.
Yeah.
And those justifications, you look, all of the original developers of it were all steeped in Kabbalah, especially the Hasidic movement. Not the entire Hasidic movement, in particular, Shabbat Hasidic movement, which is a Sabbatian movement. And this
that's what exactly, the Sabbatian movement. So are these guys connected to them in a direct sense? Do you think so?
Yes. So the founder of so what's interesting, if you look at the emergence of the Hasidic movement, it emerged very closely aligned. It was rejected by the Orthodox Jews at the time as a heretical movement. There's Vilna Gaon, who's the famous scholar of the time, who denounced them as heretics. Mm-hmm. And the several branches developed, and the one in particular that was founded the Lubavitch movement was a suspected Sabbatian. And so this is where there's a few tracks we can go back to. I'm going to try to keep it brief, but basically what's curious that I point out, the various scholars look at the history of Kabbalah, because Kabbalah really its origins began in Babylon in the 6th century BC, but it sort of went underground for about 1,000 years and emerged right after the Crusades. And so most scholars of Kabbalah tried to explain how would this be possible. And one of the sources that they point to as a possible source of survival is the Sabians of Harran. And there's two reasons for that in similarities. And one of them is very important to the history of Kabbalah, because there's two branches of study in Kabbalah, and one of them is called Masa Merkaba, which is the visions of the throne, effectively, based on the throne described in Ezekiel. And the other one is Shir Koma. And Shir Koma is basically his long, detailed descriptions of the body of God. How tall he is, how long his limbs are, what his crown looks like, and things like that. Anthropomorphic.
Okay.
Right.
Some of the scholars, I think in Islam, some of the people were like that as well.
Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah is effectively, there was a problem where the Hanbali movement had some suspect anthropomorphic teachings. So, the Hanbali movement itself is a legitimate madhab, so it's not to malign the school itself, but there were tendencies, and Ibn Taymiyyah was the foremost representative of it. And it's primarily the reason why he was in jail for so much of his life, put there because of he wasn't recanting his anthropomorphic claims. There's a famous case where Ibn Battuta, the famous Muslim traveler, he came to a mosque. I think it was in Damascus when Ibn Taymiyyah was preaching. So some people dispute this, but it's kind of more telling about Ibn Taymiyyah's reputation in general. That he said that Ibn Taymiyyah stepped down the 3 steps of the minbar and said that when Allah descends from the highest heaven, he descends like this.
SubhanAllah. Oh my
exactly. God. And I think it was Ibn Battuta who said that Ibn Taymiyyah had a screw loose. So there's a great article online, an academic article about Ibn Taymiyyah called "Did Ibn Taymiyyah Have a Screw Loose?" And I think the scholar is called David Little, if I remember his name correctly, if anybody wants to look at it, which explores. But anyway, this is a detailed, it's a complex history of Ibn Taymiyyah's career. He was a formidably intelligent person, but I think one description of him was that his knowledge exceeded his intelligence or something like that. You know, he was brilliant, extremely knowledgeable, but
So he's got like a
he's off
secret
track.
thing, a mysterious thing to him.
Who knows what his intentions are, right? Well,
Yeah.
this is what I bring up in my book. Is what's so strange is that Ibn Taymiyyah happens to come from Harran, which is the seat of another occult society whose main focus was an anthropomorphic interpretation of God. So it's very suspicious. So the core of Ibn Taymiyyah's attacks was not only his anthropomorphic doctrine, but his reinterpretation of ijtihad. So he claimed that he was qualified to make ijtihad. So he kind of provided various arguments that made it possible to interpret, by some to interpret that it was possible to keep the doors of ijtihad open. And this is the argument in particular that was adopted by Sheikh al-Wahhab in Saudi Arabia in the mid 1700s. So who apparently was a Donmeh.
Okay, so what about, Sabbatai, Sabbatai Zevi?
Yes.
Okay, that's before the Dönmeh. That's before the Dönmeh.
Yeah. Okay. So again, there's a lot of history there to go through. I'm going to go.
We're just doing something right now.
But basically, Sabbatai Zevi is central to this entire history. You have you have the Kabbalah, which emerges in the 1200s, 12th century, according to Gershom Scholem, between 1150 and 1200. And then you have what's called the New Kabbalah. And New Kabbalah emerges with Isaac Luria in the 1500s, who was based in Safed in Palestine. So he's considered really sort of the godfather of modern Kabbalah, offered some profound reinterpretations. And a couple of things that were happening also, the Jews were being expelled from various parts of the world. It's important, particularly Spain. It's important to remember here, Muslims to remember that this is at the point when the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire invited the Jews to come settle in his territories.
Yes.
So what happens is that a lot of the Jews were forced to convert to Christianity. Yeah,
even the Muslims.
The Muslims as well too. So that's why a lot of them were expelled. Those who stayed behind had to convert. Many left. A lot of Muslims left as well. And so those who converted are called Moranos.
Moranos and Moricos, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Moranos and Moricos, yeah.
So, but of course they continue to practice their religion in secret. So according to Gershom Scholem, this all set the stage for the Sabbatian movement. The interpretation he offers is that there was such a catastrophe. It was perceived as such a catastrophe. And Isaac Luria's teachings, basically messianic teachings, sort of fed this messianic expectation that the Jews now, having seen this, all this persecution that they endured, were longing for some kind of, release and messianic era. And so what I show in my books is the degree to which the mission of Sabbatai Zevi, because Sabbatai Zevi declared himself Messiah in 1666, but his mission that year had been part of the expectations of the Rosicrucians. And so when you look at the Rosicrucian, first of all, Rosicrucians was a Protestant cult, and Protestantism itself was very much a Marrano movement. It was a movement of Marranos attempting to overthrow the power of the Catholic Church. And so that's why many leading Kabbalists at the time saw Luther as kind of like a messianic figure and hoped that Luther was going to help sort of emancipate the Jews in a way. And Luther himself, because Luther taught a doctrine called justification through sin. So not justification through faith, excuse me. And so, but it's not an accident that I said that, because that idea came from Kabbalah. It's effectively saying that your actions don't really determine your salvation. So out of the Protestant movement, now you basically, so this whole tradition from the Templars and this occult tradition that had survived in Europe emerged as the Rosicrucian movement, and they were very closely aligned with the chief rabbi of Amsterdam. His name was Manasseh ben Israel. So he was friends with all of these Rosicrucians in England. Three of them in particular, they're known, that compose a group called the Hartlib Circle. And so this circle was very closely connected and following closely the mission of Sabbatai Zevi. And because as everybody, it's probably a well-known fact, Sabbatai Zevi, again, he declared himself Messiah in 66.
Yeah.
Then, of course, it was expected that he was going to march on Istanbul and come with, with the aid of the 12 tribes, he was going to effectively conquer the Ottoman Empire. So he was invited and challenged by the Sultan, and Sabbatai Zevi decided to convert, quote unquote, convert to Islam. This was interpreted by his followers as being a sort of a cryptic conversion. The same thing as the Moranos that done in Spain. It was a conversion of convenience, a conversion, and it had this whole sort of ideological rationalizations about the need of the Messiah to descend through evil before being able to, return as Messiah, all this, whatever, convoluted mysticism. So that spread the influence of so basically the Rosicrucians were very much a Sabbatian movement, and then with the help of Manasseh ben Israel, they were with negotiations with Oliver Cromwell, Jews were allowed to return to England. They had been forbidden from living there since 1290. And there they established the first important synagogue in London called Bevis Marks Synagogue. And so that synagogue was mostly run by Sabbatian rabbis and had very close connections with the Royal Society, because the Royal Society was effectively a Rosicrucian society. The Hartlib Circle also was known as the Invisible College. The Invisible College became the basis of the founding of the Royal Society, and the Royal Society became the basis for the founding of Freemasonry. So that's where you get this thread happening here. So back to Sabbatai Zevi. So he had followers in many parts of Europe, particularly Poland and Czechoslovakia, but also in Turkey, particularly the city of Salonika in Greece as well, which is a very heavily Jewish populated city. So many of his followers followed his conversion to Islam, and they did the same. That's why from that point forward, they were known as Dönmeh. And so there's numerous rumors, most of them well justified, that Ataturk himself was a Dönmeh. The Young Turk movement that was responsible for effectively the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire was a Dönmeh Sabbatian movement. When the Nazi Party was renamed, was a sort of reorganization of the German Workers' Party, and the German Workers' Party was created by the Thule Society. And the Thule Society was founded by Rudolf von Bettendorf, who had just come back from studying Kabbalah with the Dönmeh in Turkey.
Wow.
Who else was also circulating in this network of young Turks in Turkey was Jamal Afghani.
Oh, yes.
Who was the founder of the Salafi movement. So you can see that all these channels sort of follow each other. Yeah.
Muhammad Abdu.
Right. So it's all the same network. So basically what happens now in the 1750s, what's unique about Saudi Arabia is that it's one of the few areas of the world that had not been conquered by any world power. If you look at the map of the Roman Empire basically controlled almost everything around it. Same thing with the Persian Empire. That is a one little area that escaped domination. It's quite exceptional. And so they couldn't be bothered. What the reality is.
Deserts and dunes.
In desert. And there's various hadiths about the horns of Dajjal coming out of Najd. I think, am I repeating that correctly?
Yeah.
And so in 17, so there's a very curious work, and this really started my my research. A lot of people might argue with me with this one. It's a book called The Memoirs of Mr. Hempfer, and So supposedly a British spy, subtitle British Spy to the Middle East or something like that. It's a very curious book. It claims that it had been released and translated by, published by in a German magazine. I contacted them to ask them if they had ever seen anything like it. They said no, they had never published anything. And so very suspicious circumstances. This book has yet to be verified, but there is one Ottoman scholar from the 1800s who does refer to a British spy named Hemfer working with Abdul Wahhab. But one thing, regardless of whether that's true or not, one thing is clear, that Abdul Wahhab's mission was truly unique. I don't think we've ever seen anything as audacious and controversial in Islamic history. So what he did is that he revived Ibn Taymiyyah's concept of rejecting ijtihad to effectively argue that those who did certain Sufi practices, and like I always say, I'm not condoning these certain practices. I myself find them suspicious, but he took them far enough to claim that those people who conducted those practices were now kafirs. And so the entire Islamic world, millions of people around the world were all kafirs except himself and anybody who accepted his bizarre teachings. And so what he effectively did, since now they were kafirs, it was allowed to kill them. Yeah. So he called for a jihad against the Muslims. So you can see, regardless of the claims of the Hemfer memoirs, how tidily this Abdul Wahhab's mission fit with British intentions in the area. And so this is where you get the first swirlings of the influence of the revival. In fact, scholars refer to it as revivalism, which is chiefly based around resurrecting the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah. And so now, 150 years later, you get a guy named Jamal al-Afghani, who is born in Iran, so he's actually a Shia, impersonating a Sunni, and gets kicked out of every place he goes to. He ends up in Egypt, where he becomes Grand Master of the Freemasons. And what's very curious is that his main disciple is Muhammad Abdu. And they used to refer to their Masonic brothers as Ikhwan al-Safa wa Khunan al-Marwa, which is exactly the name of the Brethren of Sincerity. So they explicitly refer to themselves as the Brethren of Sincerity. It's a cult brotherhood originally influenced by the Sabians, because they were.
You said yes, isn't it?
Or Ismailis. So they were doing this deliberately because they were a Masonic group, because this fit in with the Masonic legend that they could propose themselves to the European Masons as being representatives of the so-called surviving tradition of the Eastern mystics that had, survived in Egypt, which fits in with all these legends of Egyptian Freemasonry and so on and so forth. So that's where he and Muhammad Abdu align. So now Afghani becomes responsible for the founding of three important traditions. So one of them is Salafism, which is based on proposing the revival of ijtihad. And the other one is Theosophy. So he becomes one of the what's called ascended masters of H.P. Blavatsky, who is basically, she's considered the godmother of the New Age movement.
I'm aware of that.
Yeah. One of the leading personalities of what's called the Occult Revival. She was, because what happens now is that, so the Sabbatian movement, so apparently the Rothschilds had converted to Sabbatianism. They work closely with a family called the Landgraves of the House of Hessen-Kassel in Germany, who were the chief backers of not only the Illuminati, but a group called the Asiatic Brethren. And the Asiatic Brethren were founded by the nephew of Jacob Frank, who was the next most important person in the history of Sabbatianism. He came along 150 years later, 100 years later, and declared himself the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi. So most modern Sabbatianism, European Sabbatianism, could be traced back to Jacob Frank. So, and so this, well, I'm not going to get into here, but this is what I cover in my latest book on Zionism, because this is where Zionism begins. It begins from the Asiatic Brethren, and there they founded what's called the Frankfurt Juden Lodge in Frankfurt. And so initiated to that lodge was Edward Bulwer-Lytton, and Edward Bulwer-Lytton becomes the leader of the occult revival, of which Blavatsky is a part. Another person, and because the Asiatic Brethren eventually transform into the Golden Dawn, and the Golden Dawn was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is the most important occult society.
Yeah, it was very prevalent in Japan and Russia and North Korea. The Golden Dawn.
No, that's a different group. This is the
Are you talking about the one with the sun with the lights?
This would be the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It's a secret society, British founded secret society. So Aleister Crowley would have been a member. Right. So another person was Saint-Yves d'Alvèdre, Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvèdre, and he was the founder of what's called Synergism. And so this is what I was able to prove with some help a couple of years ago, was that Afghani, because the person, Saint-Yves d'Alvèdre, came to have come in contact with a person who went by the name of Haji Sharif, who claimed to be an Afghan prince. And when you see the photos, I put them side by side. In fact, I overlapped them in Photoshop to make sure, and it's the same person. So Afghani took on many disguises. One of them was as a Nasseddin master for Blavatsky, another was as a reformer of Islam, and the other one was as this Indian mystic who introduced al-Delvraj to the legends of Agartha. And so in all these channels now, basically with Edward Bulwer-Lytton being the chief personality, basically splitting into these various branches, formed the basis of the Nazi regime. And that's why it's important. This is how you can explain the close relationship that the Nazis had with the Salafis, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. After the Muslim Brotherhood was founded, Hitler approached Hassan al-Banna and asked him to put the Muslim Brotherhood at the disposal of Nazi intelligence. And this is how after World War II, with the Nazis, basically they lost, but all the leading ones went to work for the CIA, and so the control of the Muslim Brotherhood passed over into the CIA, and all this, of course, was funded by the Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia again was a Wahhabi state created with the intent of destroying the Islamic world. They through World War I. They didn't directly participate, but what the British did is that they recruited Sharif Hussein and his son to fight the Ottoman Turks, promising them that they would make them kings of the Arabs after. But of course, as well known, they signed a Sykes-Picot agreement and they went back on all their promises. They shipped Abdullah to Jordan instead, and they gave Israel to the Jews, to Lord Rothschild in particular. And in Saudi Arabia, they did the same thing. Instead of Sharif Hussein lost Mecca, and it got handed over effectively to the Saudi royal family, who were originally also, so both Sheikh Abdul Wahhab and the Saudi royal family, according to research that I've discovered, were Dönmeh. This is interesting because I think it was back in 2009, I believe, the Americans were going through the documents, is Iraqi intelligence documents, and they found this report. And I'm pretty grateful because they translated the whole report, and the report was basically a compilation of all the research that had been done substantiating the claim that the Saudi royal family was Jewish, and more specifically that they were Dönmeh. And I've got articles on my site if anyone wants to find that. So effectively, that's the history of the Dönmeh. And so basically, once they established Saudi Arabia, 1932, the following year, they gave concessions to the Rockefeller family, SoCal, to drilling rights. And that basically began the 20th century because oil, as we know, powered the Western hegemon. And so basically our money, which was robbed, right, the money that belongs to us that should be going to help Palestine, to help Africa out of poverty, to stabilize the world effectively, has been used for the reverse, has been used through the CIA to advance basically the Zionist agenda of rebuilding the Third Temple.
So basically, how I see it, Saudi Arabia has been like a
Complicit.
big share in all of the wars,
Major
because
partner.
they've been giving all the oil for all the
That's right.
machinery and everything.
Exactly.
That's
So
amazing.
if you look at so most of the, you know, it's the American government is fairly complex, right? So you got the various branches of the government, but a lot of things, most of the dirty actions were carried out by the CIA. Most the coups and overthrows, maybe not some of the overt wars, like, but I mean, the CIA usually participates in it. But most of the devious actions, a lot of it, like destabilization of states and regime changes, have been through the CIA. There's two fronts that have been used throughout the century as fronts for the CIA, and that is the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, Saudi Arabia until recently was at least, I think it was a third of the world's oil comes from Saudi Arabia. And you know the most influential family, the Rockefeller family, founders of the Council on Armed Foreign Relations, Council of Trilateral Commission, the front for the CIA. Most of the actions that have shaped the 20th century have been funded with our oil that has been expropriated by this family who were installed with the British help
Is the Bin
to
Laden
overthrow the Ottoman Empire,
the Bin
overthrow our heritage.
Yeah, and Bin Laden Group of Industries has a big share in this, is it?
Yes, so exactly. What I cover in my Terrorism Illuminati book is the close relationship between Salman bin Laden, so that's bin Laden's older brother, and Khalid bin Mahfouz, who was the head of the Saudi Commercial Bank, working in Texas with not George Bush directly, but George Bush's James Bath, I think is what it was, who was also working with the CIA. But this is part of a large, basically Israeli operation known as Iran-Contra. And the point was to basically trade weapons with Iran to be traded. To trade weapons with Iran to be sold in Nicaragua to fund the Contras, which were then traded for cocaine, which was sold in
America.
Pasadena, Arkansas, under Bill Clinton's watch, which basically ignited the crack cocaine epidemic, to raise money to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which was a Muslim Brotherhood operation. So basically a CIA tool to destabilize and ultimately bring down.
USSR. USSR, right?
Correct.
Okay. Before we finish, why don't you give us a little brief about your books? Because you have a like a
Yeah.
biography. Yeah.
So I got quite a few. So I mean, most of my research is basically trying to it covers the span from the verses how to Talmud and the development of Kabbalah in Babylon in 6th century BC, and my first book really focuses on identifying how that developed, using all the academic support I could to substantiate the case that this began with the what's called the Chaldean Magi who spread to Greece, and how this all influenced Greek philosophy and European history, how this evolved into through the Templars, the Freemasons, and so on. Terrorism Illuminati continues off of that, but then looks into the relation, much of what we just discussed now about its evolution into Islam. The Black Terror, White Soldiers, again, looks back a lot of it and looks specifically at very much at the history of the attack on ijtihad leading right up until our times. I also wrote a book on transhumanism. So this is a completely separate subject, but crucial because it really goes at the core. We're looking at two parallel agendas that are happening in our time. So what's happening in Israel is crucial, but also we can't escape the fact of this transhumanist agenda, which is basically sort of creating an apparatus of technology which is going to enable the expanding totalitarianism, which is what they're aiming for. And my most recent book is, in fact, I wrote a 6-volume book, 6-volume book called Occult, which goes into a lot more details, a whole lot of material that I was, like all my other books combined, form about 15% of what I was able to put together in Occult. Is a much more deep material about the Sabbatean movement, about the Rosicrucians, about the Illuminati, especially in our time, the confluence between transhumanism, movements known as Discordianism, the collusion between Russia and Trump, and all these things sort of fit together. And my latest book is called Zionism: A History of a Jewish Heresy, which shows how Zionism evolved from the teachings of Jacob Frank, the Sabbatian teachings of Jacob Frank, and two trajectories. One of them was to development of German nationalism, starting with people like Hegel and all the famous German philosophers, through the 19th century, up to people like Bulwer Lytton and Blavatsky and Dalved and even Jamal al-Afghani, simultaneously with basically the Sabbatians, the Frankists were developing both. That if you look at the history of German nationalism, it was almost always Frankists. And the rise of anti-Semitism was usually Frankists who were behind it. Frankists who basically were opposed to Orthodox Judaism. And so basically that explained their anti-Semitism and their revulsion for traditional Jews, because effectively they were not only they reject Judaism, but Judaism had rejected them. So they were sort of taking out their revenge against the
like some kind of apostates trying to get back, or like trying to think they were theirs. So like the way let's summarize this, the way you're saying is like maybe the past 2000 years have been like completely chaotic, like they have been infiltrating and influencing every group in a way, in order to shape up the events that have come up in front of us right now.
So we have to understand, like, this is why I say, like, if you look at what's happening in Israel right now, it should make obvious to most of the world that we've been taught so many ideologies. If you look in public debate right now, it's all about gender identity, liberalism, fascism, communism, capitalism, secularism, isms, schisms. But it should be obvious now that all those are distractions, that what's really been happening, at the heart of the core developments of the political developments of the 20th century, is the same protagonists as the Bible. Right? We're living a follow-up chapter of the Bible, where the Bible is the story of this people who were rescued from Egypt, granted a promise of a return to a land, building their temple, having that temple destroyed, being dispersed across the world, and expecting in the end to be returned to their land of promise, to land of Zion, and to rebuild their temple and receive the Messiah. That's what we're experiencing. So, unfortunately, is that it's being carried out by a group who are effectively heretics to Judaism, who falsely claim to represent the Jews, but they're fanatical fringe, who have a very distorted interpretation of Judaism, and so that's what we're experiencing. But it's not only there; it's expectations shared by every religion, right? So the Christians expect many of the same prophecies for the end times, as do the Muslims. So it's sort of like all these things have been foretold. I'm not sure if we're actually entering into them. What's happening is that you have a group who is actively working to bring about their fulfillment.
That was really good, man. Thank you very much for your time today, and would love to have you again. There's so much to discuss. Like
there is a lot,
yeah. Thank you very much, man. Have a good time.
Okay.
I'm gonna definitely share your links in the description, and I'm gonna share you the link as soon as it's posted. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Salam alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Take care, sir.